Well, it's great to be here. What I'm going to do is show you some examples of using HTML5 and some of the power of this wonderful capability that we have on hand. I'm going to go through as much as I can in the 50 minutes that we have with us. So let's get started. Of course, the first question is, what's all this excitement about? Why do we care about HTML5? We had a great definition of what it is from Scott earlier, and we saw some of the benefits of using it. And one of the key things about HTML5 is that you actually have to do less to get more out of it, which certainly is, in the way that I would look at it, is productivity, right? You don't want to be wasting your time and effort doing things that can be done for you. And so HTML5 gives the opportunity to do less, and you can get more out of it. It's a standard, so as a result, more and more browsers are going to support it. Life becomes a lot easier. And so given that, let's talk about some of the things. If you are interested in developing web applications, we know the pain of what we deal with. We have div tags after div tags after div tags nested several levels low. And you know, if you've used it, what do you normally do with div tags? There are two things you do with div tags. You give classes to div tags, and you give IDs to div tags, which is fine for most of us because we're used to it. But the biggest challenge is that you know what those div tags are, but nobody else knows about it. And if you have a tool or a device that's got, Scott talked about semantic meaning, well, the semantic meaning there is zero, right? Because everything is a div, and what in the world does it mean? You don't have a clue. So that's kind of lost in the translation. One of the nice things about HTML5 is you no longer have to depend on those div tags. You have more semantically meaningful tags that you can use to define your content. So let's take a look at an example. So there are some interesting content tags that you can use, what I call as a special descriptive tags here. And one of them, for example, is a header. Now you could, when you think of a header, don't think of this as a HTML header. That's not what we're talking about here. These are segments in your HTML that you can define as a section, and you can have headers and footers associated with them. And so you can have headers and similarly footers. And you can also have navigation areas where you can define various things. You can have sections. And sections and articles are a bit confusing, but it's important to know what these two are. And at some point, it looks like they're interchangeable. But sections can have articles, and articles can have sections. But think of these as more of a logical grouping, if you will. For example, let's say you're writing a magazine article, and in your magazine article, you're going to have, maybe your magazine has several articles in it. You can think of these as sections, and sections can have different articles in it. And then once you open an article and start reading through it, that can have separate sections as well, and where you're detailing certain areas. So you could have some of those as well. And a side is something very useful to put things on the side. So let's take a look at an example how this would look like. So let's start with a little simple example here. What I want to do is look at writing a simple HTML page with some of these HTML5 modern tags associated with it. And then while we do it, we'll take a look at how this is going to appear on the browser. So I have Safari that I've brought up here. I'm going to switch over to browsers later on when I need it, but this is good enough for now to begin with. So what I'm going to do, and that's kind of cached in something, so I'm going to start with a Doctype, as you can see here. So I'm going to start with a Doctype, and this is going to be telling us that we're using HTML5, so that's like the fundamental basic tag you start with. The next line should be quite familiar to you, right? This is where you're linking your style sheet that you want to use. In this case, I'm going to use a style sheet called style.css, which doesn't have anything right now at the moment. And then, of course, you start with your HTML tag. That's no difference, right? And within that, I have a little speaker header. So that's basically the starting point. Now, what I'm going to do here within that is I'm defining a header, and I'm going to define speakers as a header. So this is like a conference website I want to put together with some details in it. So I'm going to say that there's a header called, with an ID called speakers. And then within that, I'm going to have some navigation bars in it. And within this, I could say, for example, I want to say what are the sessions in this conference. So that should look very familiar, traditional HTML. And then I could say there are schedules available, and then there are details about the speaker that's available as well. So as I am doing that, as you can see, we have those pop up along the way, and we can take a look at what those contents are and deal with it. So similarly, I can have a style sheet that's going to style these things. So as you can see, as I created this is a traditional HTML. So as a result, you have list items being listed one after the other. That looks pretty ugly, but we can fix that through style sheeting. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. And then, of course, now comes the interesting part where I want to define a section. So a section is going to be a logical grouping of things, and in this case, I want to say my section is going to contain list of speakers, for example. So in this case, within the section, I have an article. Again, look at these as a containment hierarchy or a collection hierarchy. So I've got a section, and within that I've got article. And then within this article, I'm going to put some of the speaker information. For example, I say Scott over here and his company, so I can list that. And then similarly, I'm going to say aside, and then I'm going to put a little aside information. I'm going to say Scott is a cool guy with the long hair. I forgot to update that he wears girls' clothes, but that's a different story. So we could have these asides being printed along the way. But what you really want to do is you want this to be structured differently. One of the, yes, we had Cascade style sheets. Those were good. But at some point, we still started mixing the presentation details with the HTML itself. One of the things HTML5 does is a much clearer separation of concern. You can deal with the content very separately, and the presentation can be managed completely separately. So that separation becomes even more critical and clear, if you will. And we'll see how to do that in just a second. So then I'm going to, of course, put my information in there in this particular context. So that is basically my article. And then I'm also going to put a footer here, which simply says there's a copyright information. And that's going to appear in the bottom right here. So we got a bunch of content, but we really want to structure this in a much more logical manner, in more of a presentation. Well, as we know, that's where the style sheet comes in. So what I'm going to do, again, notice that I have different tags here. I have header, and I have a section, and then, of course, I have a nav. And then within this section, I have article, and I have an aside, and then I have more of the articles. If you notice that two of my articles belong to this section up here, and then after the section itself, I have a footer, which contains regular HTML elements. Now, how am I going to style sheet this and present this information? Let's take a look at that for a minute. So I'm going to leave that on the side while we look at this. So let's go ahead and write a style sheet for it. So what am I going to do? First of all, I'm going to say put a header for the speakers. So header speaker nav, I'm going to define a content for it. And I'm going to say there's no style for it. And I'm going to say there's a margin and a padding. And you can see as I'm editing that, you can see that it's removed the margin, it removed the padding. So it's responding to my style sheeting at this point. Similarly, I'm going to go ahead and define speaker, nav, ul, and li. So you can see how easy it is to start structuring these style sheet. So I focused on the content when I wrote the HTML, as you can see. Whereas here I've said, well, I've got the header, and header is the name of the element, HTML element. And of course, speakers is the ID. So you put a pound in between to specify it. And then you started listing the children elements one after the other. And it says, I'm going to structure, style sheet those. And then I said display is inline. I don't want this to be a block structure. Don't put this on a separate line. And then I want no margin or no padding. And you can see that it's structured that very differently. We can continue along this. And I can say, for example, for the section, I want the width to be 40%. And I could also then say that for the section with the speakers list, and within that in the article, I want you to float it to the left, and I want this to be 75%. And then I can also say that for the aside, I want it to be on the right side, and I want it to give a width of 25%. So you can see how it is beginning to structure this as we modify the style. It's putting it on the right side. So you can style sheet again and say where you want to display these things, and you can change it. Again, I'm constrained by the space here because of the font that I'm using, but you can see how it's structuring around this. And then, of course, for the footer, I'm going to put the footer, and I'm clearing all the styles on it so it appears towards the very bottom, so you can see how we ended up styling it. So that's basically the first part of this, is we looked at the headers, the footers, the nav, and all these different sections, and I also showed you how you could structure these using the style. And like I mentioned, one of the nice things about this is a much clearer separation of concern. So you are putting the HTML elements separately, and you're style sheeting this separately, so keep this very nice. So if you want to change the format, you can simply change it into the style sheet much more effectively. You're not dealing with your class tags as much. If you notice, there are two things that are missing in the example I gave you, right? If you're doing this in a traditional HTML, you're going to probably use quite a bit of div tags. You're going to probably use more IDs and classes. So certainly I'm not using any classes here for structuring. I'm navigating through the hierarchy much more in this case. One of the interesting things talking about style sheet itself is that you have a nice, effective way for you to drill down and start styling various contents. I'm going to talk about tables for a minute and show you how easy it is to look at some of the table elements that you would want to structure, for example. So let's say for a minute that I want to have a content where I'm going to specify, let's say, various days of the conference, and I want to say that in each of the days of the conference, how many people are attending. So let's say I have a little table. That's all I have. And if you look at this table, the table kind of appears with no style as you expect. That is all the table I created. At this point, pure regular HTML, nothing fancy. So I have a section called days. Within that, I have a horizontal rule. I've got number of attendees. And then I've given the ID for the topics, table as topics. And then if you notice, I simply have the table rows listing the number of attendees, and then finally a total. So maybe this is an output you would get from some web application, right? Backed up by some database, maybe this spits out this HTML. But I want to structure this. So what am I going to do to structure this particular element? So what I'm going to do, let's take baby steps and look at how we would do this. So I want to start, first of all, and start dictating various styles for this. So I have a header, as you can see here. So basically, this one is the table header. And I would like to really say my header has a certain style. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say my table header is here. And the table header style, I'm going to say background and let's say color. And the background color, I want this to be, let's say, all black color in here. So basically, I'm going to give it a black color. Not very helpful at this point because it just made the header black. And as a result, we don't see the real heading. But I could fix that. So I could then say, for example, color, and then I could say my color that I would like here is white in color, and you can see that it shows the content in the header has been modified. So again, I'm just giving a regular style over here for this. But then comes the interesting point. What I would like to do is typically when you have a table, oftentimes we have problem reading a table because of parallax error, right? So you're reading the table and you make mistakes reading multiple different rows. So we normally use the zebra styling, right? So you vary the style for each one of these back and forth. I'm sure everybody here has done that at some point. And was that fun doing it? Not really, right? Because why? Because when you spit out your table, you had to write an ID or a class, most likely a class called an even class or an odd class, and then what you had to do is provide a style based on an even and an odd class. The problem there is when you do that, you get into trouble when you use Ajax, for example, and start injecting rows in between. I'm sure each one of you wasted an hour or two with this, right? And you say, darn it, why doesn't it really color it properly? Now it's messed up, and you realize, oh, now I got to know whether it's even or odd, and you say, there's got to be a better way to do it. Well, there is, right? And that is exactly what this is. Why not just forget about, putting these odd and even is like static thing, and you don't want it to be really static. You know what the table is at this moment. Why not just walk through the table right now? Notice in my table itself, I did not specify anything about even and odd. There's no classes at all here, right? So in my table, I simply have rows. I could use Ajax and add a row to this table. I'm not worried anymore, right? I could certainly do that. So now notice what I'm going to do. I go to the style itself, And what I want to do is I'm going to say I have a table row, but what I would like to do is to take the nth of type, and I want this to be an even type. Isn't that cool, right? So you could really execute a command, and so think about this like a function call. So you're saying, hey, go extract or filter out only the nth row, which is of type even. And similarly, you could have other functions you can pass to it. And so this is going to simply filter out and extract those rows from the table that are even in this particular case. And I want to go ahead and give a detail for it. So what do I want to do here? I'm going to say background color for this one here. So color. And I would like to give a background color. So let's go ahead and say color is going to be, let's go ahead and say some color. Don't rely on my color scheming capabilities. But it's a little odd to see here, but trust me here, there is a coloring of the even, and you will see this much better when you go to the odd itself. You should be able to see that. I don't know if you can see it there. It's a little odd, but I will give you the next color. So similarly, I'm going to just copy that, and I'm going to paste it, but this time I'm going to change this to an odd, and let's go ahead and change this color. I want to give a different color here. Let's say C1 is the color I want to use over here, and you can see the color change. This is a bit more easier to see it, right? So you can see that I've changed the color. And just to show you that that worked as well, I could change it to a much darker color. Okay, so that doesn't want to work. All right, so you can see that there is a color coding in here. But what I would also like to do, which is really interesting, is you could apply multiple combination of things in here. So for example, let's say I want to really modify this one element over here. Well, the way I can identify that, for example, is this is the last row and the last column, right? So I could specify that. So what am I going to do? I can say here, I want to say this is the last child. So not only the nth of type, but you can also say a last child. And what I would like to do in this case is I'm going to say, for example, font weight over here and bolder. So I'm going to make this much more heavier in the bold. I don't know if you noticed it, but it became bolder. But it changed the total as well. And I really don't want to change the total at this particular point. But we'll fix it in a second. So similarly, I'm going to say background color. And in this case, I want this background color to be different as well. So I'm going to say this is maybe a different color. Okay, that's a little ugly yellow there that I put. But I don't want the total to change. So notice I can simply say here, not only do I want to change the TR, I can also say the TD is the last child as well. So in this case, we filtered it a little differently, and you can see that it doesn't do the total anymore, and it only did that last column. So again, you can have these different styles that you can combine together, and I hope you would agree, this is much better than trying to put classes through every element in HTML and then mess with it, right? So now if you were to just run Ajax call into it and start injecting things, it's going to filter differently and say, all right, I'm cool. It's even or odd. I'm going to examine it. So it just makes life a lot easier. That's what you're seeing here. So that is basically an example of how you could style these things a little differently and work through it. All right, so that's good so far. But once again, the name of the game here, among all the other things that we talked about, is the semantic meaning. You want to be able to specify what this is really about. Now, what is the benefit of semantics? Again, Scott will talk about some of the beauties of semantically driving the web. There are several advantages to it, but one advantage from the HTML point of view is if I know what this element is about, then my browser can do special things about it. For example, if you were to use an iPhone, one of the nice things about an iPhone is when you are selecting a particular page, if it is an email field, you click on the email field, you definitely want the keyboard to change over to type the email much more easily. Or you say, hey, this is a URL, and you click on the field which is a URL, and if it only knows it's a text field, you type http:// it's quite a bit of an effort. But if it can recognize that it's a URL and not just a regular text field, It can again change your keyboard. You can have a .com, and you can hold it down. It can give you these other options like .edu or .org and so on. So it just makes your experience much easier. And one of the real key things is to make it easier for the users to use the application. That's the real purpose, isn't it? So in order to do that, what they have done is they've created some very specialized or targeted input types. Let's take a look at a couple of examples here. So let's say for a minute that this conference website wants to do a little bit more. What they want to do is they want to know, they want to add new speakers into the conference. So they want to have a form where they can start adding names and stuff like that. So notice what I'm going to do here. I'm going to say a section, and within the section, I'm going to create a form, and you could say method equals post. And within the form, I'm going to basically select, like let's say, a form field over here. So field set. Field set. And within this, my first field, I'm going to say input type equals submit or button. You could do that. So whatever that you want to specify, you could select that. So there's this ugly submit button that showed up. But I also want to specify the name of the speaker. That's the first thing I would like, isn't it? So input name equals name of the speaker. And so maybe ID equals, and I could say speaker, speaker name. So that's basically my ID field input. And I could define a label here, for example. So I could say label and then define a label for a name. So that's good. But now I want to take the email address of the speaker. So label, and I'm going to say email. And in this particular case, I'm going to say input. So this is input, and I'm going to say type equals email. So in this case, the type is going to be a text, right? That's the default that you use. Whereas here, the type is going to be an email type. You don't see a whole lot of difference right here. It depends on what the browser wants to do. Maybe the browser can be smart enough to give you some validation logic and saying, oh, this is an email, and what you enter is not really an email, and so on. But more so, this is really useful in a mobile device, because the minute you click on the email field, immediately the keyboard is going to change to make it easier for you to type an email. So that's basically the email tag. But let's go a little further with this. Not only can I create an email tag, but for almost any input, you can create a placeholder. How many of you have written applications for iPhone, for example? Okay, quite a few of us. One of the nice things about an iPhone application is you have these fields, but in a very grayed out manner, it would list you certain example content. So this really helps the users to not sit there and wonder, what do I type? They kind of get a clue for what is expected in it. And the minute you start typing something into it, that placeholder goes away. So this is much better and less noisy than trying to put documents on the side describing what this field is. So this is a much nicer user experience. So notice what I'm going to do. I'm going to use a placeholder. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to simply say placeholder equals, and email address, so email at example.com. So notice as soon as I do it, I don't know if you're able to see it from there, but here it says email at example.com. Let me see if I zoom in, you're able to see. But the whole intent is that you shouldn't be able to see it too clearly, right? So that's kind of grayed out, and it's sitting there. And the minute you click on it, that would go away, and you start typing the real stuff that you want to type in. So that's a much nicer user experience, right? So, remember that there is a saying that happy cows give you better milk. Well, happy users give you more money, right? So you want to kind of please them to do that. So they look at your site and say, hey, this is nice. I want to use these guys. These are cool, right? So it's a good experience. And as a programmer, that's what you die to do, right? You want to make this cool, so you kind of please the users. So there's more of these you can do, and with no effort, right? I got to share with you this experience. I'm a programmer. I know how things work. And this happened a few years ago. It was tax time, and tax time is the time you hate. And my wife was sitting there, and she knows more accounting than I would ever know. But we had a problem with our tax software, and so she says, "Hey, let's go find the answer to this." And so we click on a button. Immediately, there's a chat line where you can ask a question to an accountant. And so she enters some data, and I don't want to interrupt when she's working on it, so I quietly observe. And she goes and enters a few things. But one of the fields there is a gender, and it says you're a male or a female, and she doesn't click on it. And then she goes further, enters the data, and then says send. And I'm quietly watching this. And at this point, the website says you didn't select a gender. So immediately she clicks on the gender, and my thought behind me, I'm a sick programmer, right? That's all I keep thinking about. And my immediate thought is, hey, when she had to click on the male, did they go back and refresh the page properly and pull in the data she already entered? And sure enough, I scanned through, and that field is blank. But as a user, she doesn't think about these things, right? So she clicks on the gender, and then clicks on the send button, and now it says the other field is missing. And she's like, oh, what's up? I said, well, because you changed it, and the other field is missing. And she said, but I entered it, you saw it. I said, I saw that you entered. And the next thing she says is, you programmers, do you ever get anything right? I get scolded, right? So please, don't do this to other fellow programmers, okay? So I get blamed for some moron who didn't know what he was doing, right? So that is why it's important to have a good user experience on hand. Okay, so we did that. So we have the example placeholder. In a similar way, what we could do here is much more other things. We could do autofocus. After all, again, this is all about experience, right? You go on a page, and the page is sitting there, and you take your mouse, and you click on the field, and you start typing. And you often say, that's life in the big city, and you shrug your shoulder. But why can't they set the field in there so you don't have to set it, right? So absolutely. So notice what I'm going to do here. In this application, as you can see here, none of that is selected at the moment. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the username over here. And in the username, I'm going to say autofocus. So autofocus over here equals, for example, true. So I'm just setting the autofocus variable in this case. So autofocus is basically just a flag, I believe. So you're saying that this is autofocus field. And really the intent here is for it to set the focus on that particular field so you don't have to be writing extra code to it. And I remember doing this, where you got to sit there and write it, and it appears to work for a few minutes, and then you make some other change and it quits working. And you spend like 3 hours debugging this. There's really no reason to do it. And somebody quit messing with my computer. Okay, so that is basically an example of how you could set autofocus fields over here. And similarly, for example, you could also specify auto-completion off. For example, one of the annoying things is browsers start caching in your form data, and you say, well, okay, that makes sense for these fields, but not for these other fields. So you could say autocomplete is off, and then it won't remember on the browser side. Similarly, you could say required. So when you say required, that means that if you don't specify that field, you will get an error when you click on your submit. So again, think about this for a minute. You are not going to write any code for it. It just becomes part of your HTML. You're not writing any specific code to deal with or less JavaScript, right? You're not going to be writing JavaScript to verify these things. It's all built in. You don't have to do much work. Not only can you write required is going to just check to make sure it's not a blank. Or, placeholders are considered to be blank in this context. But you can also put a pattern, and you can say, well, this better be a telephone number pattern or an email address pattern or whatever it is. You can specify some patterns, and it's going to make sure that it's a regular expression, basically, and it's going to see if it holds to that particular expression. And similarly, what you could do is you could also specify whether it's a URL, for example. So if it's a URL, again, this makes more sense to a mobile device. It would give you a better keyboard and facilities to do things. And similarly, you could say this is a search field, for example. But I'm going to show you over here, wrong button there. So I'm going to show you here, for example, let's say a number, if I want to use a number here. What would that give us? So numbers can give you some really interesting features, like it can give you a spinner that you can specify and so on. Let's take a look at an example to see how that's going to look like. So let's say I want to define a number. So I'm going to say, one of the things here is I'm going to say a label, let's say number of sessions or talks, and then I'm going to say here input type equals number, and let's say min equals, well, you got to at least give one talk to be a speaker, and max equals, let's say 4 talks to, as a limit that I'm going to say. So notice as soon as I specify it, not only do you have a number of sessions listed here, but you can see a little thing there with an up and down arrow that you can use. It put that in there for you automatically. So I'm going to move this so you can actually see it a little bit better here. So you can see that pop up with the little thing here. So you could use that. Similarly, you could also have a range, for example. So we could say something like label speaker level, right? Some of us are beginner level speakers, as I was, and then some of us kind of, become better at what we do. So you could say that. Or you could say the level of talks you give. Some of us give introductory talks. Some of us give advanced talks. So you could have those kinds of range that you want to specify for this also. So I'm going to say input type equals a range that I want to specify. Once again, I could say min is a 1, and I could say max equals, let's say, a 10. And then we could also say a value equals a 7 as the value that I want to specify over here. And you can see that as soon as I say that this is a range, that changes to a little slider that you could use. And you can easily slide this down, up and down. Again, I would say a lot of this was influenced also by iPhone development. You can see these things already there. So they're kind of bringing that whole experience together in the browser so you can use these things. The only thing you got to remember to do, and this is very important, by the way, is you don't tell the boss that it is this simple, right? You just tell the boss it takes a lot of effort, and then get it done and go to a native place, have a good time, right? So that is key. You got to remember that, right? So don't tell the boss. So it's pretty simple, as you can see. You just drop 1 or 2 lines, and it just handles it very easily. Similarly, you could use a date, for example. And what a date gives you is you click on it, and it opens a calendar in the browser, and you can select a particular date. Similarly, you could say a date, time, and color. I don't think color pickers are fully implemented in the browsers yet. But again, as the browsers become mature, these things would become much more available for us, so we could use. We could also use in-place editing, for example. So where this helps is, those of us who have written AJAX calls, we know how painful that could be. Sure, there are some nice libraries available to us, but the two pain is, first, you got to include a third-party library, and second, you got to make sure it works properly for what you're trying to do. And again, I will tell you how many times I wasted nights where this is supposed to work, but it doesn't. And then you sit there and try to figure out, and then eventually realize, well, this library conflicts with this other library that you included, and as a result, things don't work. You've been there, right? So why take that pain? Why not just have this, as a first-class citizen? Again, you can have an in-place editing if you are interested. Let's see how this is going to look like. I know this is a stupid example, but I could simply, write a little code here. So let's say we have a speaker. What does a speaker really need? I could say, for example, the speaker, I'm going to say over here, okay, let's say a span tag, and I say ID equals requirements, and the requirements are going to be, well, the speaker wants a projector, the speaker also wants a large room, and etc. So now, as you can see, we have the projector and the large room appear here, but I'm going to basically say content editable over here, and essentially what that means is, now I can go click on this and I can start editing the content. You saw that, right? So I could go back here and start changing it, and that is the beauty of it. I've got to auto refresh there so it doesn't stay, but you can see that I can go start editing the content very easily, and then you can push that through AJAX and so on. Again, very little effort to get something like that to work. As you can see, life made very easy. So that is basically the in-place editing. But also, what we want to do is, when you look at this, you look at this table, and yeah, we have a nice thing. We have the autofocus to set the first element. We got these placeholders we can nicely have. That's all great, but after a while it gets tiring, right? You see these text boxes and they are square, and you're like, I don't want a square text box. Wouldn't it be nice if my text box is, little oval? And you say, yeah, I can do it. So now you go start creating an image, and then you start pulling in the image. And then once you have the image, you overlap the text box on it, and by the time you get it working, that's about $100 that you spend doing it. But why should it be so difficult to do? Why can't we just style our way through to do any of those? So notice what I'm going to do. And again, once again, look at the beauty. I'm not touching the HTML. I go to the style sheet, and what I'm going to do in the style sheet is I'm going to first of all specify here that I would like for the border radius to be a 10-point radius. So as soon as I do that, you can notice that it is no longer a square. It just became an oval for this, right? So this border radius 10 resulted in a nice oval shape, and you can change it. I mean, you don't have to waste $100 putting the images. Now you can waste the $100 changing the colors and all these things, right? And you can mess with those things. So you can try different radius and radius colors and so on and play with it. Similarly, I set the background to yellow in this case, and the input, notice that, I don't know if you see this or not, but in the input, I have actually changed the input. Well, actually, let me show you. It's better to show it this way. Let me comment that out for a second. If you notice here, that looks like any other text box, right? It's white in color. Well, that's what text boxes do. But if you have an image, for example, and you're putting this on top of it, it would be so cool to have a transparency, right? Well, if you already noticed here, notice I have an editor sitting in front of me, but I have the editor transparent. So you can see my background through it. And you could say, well, do you really like to look at the mountains, Venkat? I do, but that's not the point. I could have multiple editor windows. And now, think about this for a minute. How many times you're in this window, and you're like, oh, what does that mean? It's in this other window behind it, and you have to tab over to look at it. And you think about it, that's stupid. Why can't I just see through it? Well, you say, I wish I was a Superman, right? So I can see through it. Well, you don't have to be Superman. You can just have a transparent window so you can actually see through it, right? So that's exactly what you're doing here. You're saying make that transparent. So it basically sees through what's in the back of this. So if that makes sense, you could certainly do it. So as you can see, now it's no longer that white box sitting in place. Similarly, what I would like to do here is I would also like to do a few other things. For example, I'm going to say a little class called a special class, and for the special class I want to transform and rotate it. So for example, notice that I'm going to, again, you don't have to use a class. I'm just showing you that you could use a class still if you want to. So you could have written what I'm going to show you here by just navigating through the content and say aside is what I want to change. That's perfectly okay. So notice what I'm going to do now. I go to this aside over here, and I'm going to say class equals special, and notice now what happened, right? So now it's tilted over there because I told him to rotate that element, and you can see that it rotated. I've also color-coded it. I'm sure you can find better colors than that, but you can see that it was very simple to just rotate it. Again, this is an eye candy, right? It gives a nice little touch to your application. So you have a lot of content, and you can put some special things in there, so the users like, pay attention to that. That becomes easy. There is also another reason to do this, by the way. Oftentimes when you're using something like Ajax, Ajax is so nice because the entire page doesn't change. The good news is the entire page doesn't change. The bad news is the entire page doesn't change, right? And as a result, what happens? The user clicks on something here, and then hits the button. Something changes over here, and the user doesn't know it, and the user keeps clicking on it. I hope this is not withdrawing money, right? And then they call the bank and complain that I took away 100, now my bank is empty, what happened to my money? Well, you deposited and withdraw several times, and then there's a huge conversation going on. Well, you could change all of that. So the user clicks on this, you could immediately change a little, transpose things and say, hey, look, again, without annoying the user, you can draw attention to it and bring it to the locus of attention, so it becomes easier for them to see. And things like that you could do pretty easily. So that is basically an example of how I transformed it. Again, this is something that's not working across the browsers as a standard yet. Eventually it will. Again, the support kind of is evolving. So I had to use a different setup here. Transform rotate is going to be just fine, but for certain browsers you may have to change a few things along the way. Similarly, you could do shadows, and that's what gave you that little shadow on the side. Again, if you're used to Mac, you know that you could have reflection and shadows and all those nice things. You could do that here also on your browser, and very effectively that works. So that is basically about appearances. You can draw on a canvas if you want to. So again, you could really draw pictures, or you can draw certain things very easily. You could draw some things, and you could also do drag and drops if you want to. For example, let's see how we could do a drag and drop. Maybe what I would like to do is to take content and drag and drop it. Let's see how we're going to do this. So let me give you an example here. So what I would like to do here for the drag and drop is this. So first of all, I'm going to register a drag and drop over here. Well, actually, I would need a script for it, so pardon me here for a second. So this is going to be in the HTML itself. So let's go to the HTML. I'm going to create a script. So let's go ahead and say, here is my script. This is going to be language equals, let's say, JavaScript. And I would like to have a drag, a drop over here. And so what am I doing? So if you notice, I have a drag and drop, register drag and drop. So what's he doing? He says, go get me an element by ID, and then this is going to be the company. So I'm going to have an element called the company. So where is the company? So I'm going to go ahead and put the company here. So let me find a company. Okay, this is good enough. So I'm going to say ID equals the company. So now I'm going to come down here and say, all right, I've got the company on hand, and I'm going to register on drag start. You could use things like jQuery here, but my real intent is to show you that there is nothing else being included, right? You could get fancy with it if you want to and start writing even lesser code, but I want to emphasize you're not dependent on anything more unless you want to be dependent on something, right? So you're not forced into it. So right there is the on drag and drop. I'm registering a function for it. So what am I doing? Data to copy, and I'm saying go to this element, get me the attribute, and call the data-company. So this is another interesting thing. You can start defining some data values along the way. So notice I'm going to go back to my company, and I say data company equals, and then I could specify the name that I want to use over here, which may or may not be the same as the element value there. And then once I do it, I'm going to say event data transfer set data, and I'm going to say, put that into a text. So this is really like a clipboard. It copies onto it. Then I say drop target, and the drop target is going to be the URL, and I'll define that in just a second. And again, I go to the data transfer, get the data back, and then at this point, I'm going to just return that and say set that value into this value. And I'm just saying prevent defaults. I don't want you to take default actions. And then, of course, when I'm done with it, I'm disabling these other actions. So I need the URL. So let me go ahead and set the URL here for me to use. So let's go ahead and say, I'm going to write an element called the URL. That's going to be somewhere here. So let's say label. So let's go ahead and say label. And this is going to be URL. So you want to say the URL of the speaker. And then in this case, I'm going to say input type equals URL. And again, you can write the code in a way that it would put the URL with HTTP and all those good stuff. You can automate it very easily if you want to. I'm going to pull this up in Firefox right here because I'm having some difficulties with Safari to use this. So I want to just go ahead and take this over here. Again, this is the time that it doesn't want to work. Let's make sure. Okay. So this could be a problem with my connectivity also. Okay, trust me on that one. So basically the idea here is you should be able to pull that up and drag it. Let me show you at least the dragging aspect of it if I can. Did I mark this properly? Let me see. The company is right here, and that's the, okay, so that should work. The URL is going to be on an ID flag down here. I didn't give the ID for it. That's what you're saying? We're not even that far yet. I'm just trying to drag at this point. But that could be a problem a little later on. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh this and see if it's already pulling it. Thank you. So let's go ahead and see. No, okay. So, all right. Fun. Okay. All right. So, trust me, that works. You could also do other interesting things. You could do audio and video. Scott showed you how simple it is to put video tags in it. Again, the goal here is to avoid dependence on third-party products. But let me talk a little bit about client data. This is something near and dear to me. Some of my clients are very interested in using mobile devices. So, for example, they have applications on iPhone. One of the challenges they face is, iPhone is great, they are connected, all those good stuff. Then they walk over into a remote part. Their facility is some boondock somewhere, and then they walk through, there's no wireless connection. They may be in a rig, or they may be in a very a secure area where you can't really be connected to the network. So the question is, what do? Well, you got to put in a lot of effort to save stuff. In a native application, that is not bad. You got quite a few things. But what if it's a browser application? What do you do about it? So here's the beauty of this. You could store the data. So there are some different options. One is a local store. And local store simply store this on your own computer. There is also a session storage. A session storage is something that will keep storing as you move across pages. You can fetch the data. But as soon as the session expires, that will expire also. Let me show you how you could use the local store. And also you can have an offline application, but I won't have time to talk about it. But how do you use a local store? Okay, I think I know the problem here. By the way, just now I realized I didn't register the drop. So now I remember what the problem was. So let me go back here and see if that pulls up. Okay, so basically the point here is that you want to be able to do the offline tasks over here. Let me see if that comes up. All right, okay, fine. Inside the body, right? Well, the script, at the end of the script is when I want to register it. Okay, forget it. So what I want to do is this. What I would like to do is to register and get the local data. How do I do that? So what you do for that is, let's say I want to say load settings is a function I want to call. How would this look like? So I'm going to say function load settings, and I want to be able to populate a particular data. So I would say local setting, basically. So what is this local setting? It is part of the window object you can pull in, and then you say get item, and then you specify whatever item is. For example, you could say, first name over here as the item. So what is a local storage? A local storage, not settings, local storage. And the local storage really is essentially a hash map. So it keeps a name-value pair, and you can just set things into the name-value pair, and then you can pull things from the name-value pair. That's basically what you're doing. So notice I said get item, and that's going to just pull the data for you. And then you can populate your fields with this. For example, you could say, document.getElement, element by ID, and then you could say whatever. So for example, you could say first name, and then dot value equals, and then you could set that. So you would basically call that load setting, and it should do it. Similarly, when I click on a button, I could say, for example, something like function save settings, and what I could do in this case is simply say once again, I could say local storage dot set item, and in this case first name, and then I could say, for example, whatever the value should be, I can specify the value. Once again, you would go to the document and fetch the data, and then you can try to display it. This is going to just stay on your computer. This does use your domain to know what you're setting, which is a good news and a bad news. And the good news is, if you're dealing with multiple domains, those values are going to be different. But if you're testing your application on your own machine, local host is going to be the same. So you got to be a bit careful not to mess with multiple things overriding. So for that reason, I am a huge fan of usually giving more of a namespace to avoid any such conflicts. Remember, this is your code. You do what makes sense. So don't say first name. Put a little tag in there, a namespace or a package name kind of a thing, so that you can avoid these wasted time when things collide with each other and mess up things. You can just save yourself some time and effort. So that is basically, again, what is available to use local storage. Similarly, instead of using the word local storage, you could say session storage, and basically that becomes very transient, and the minute your session is over, that disappears, and so you can use that as well. So those are some of the real interesting benefits. Less work, more results, more standardized tags and capabilities. As a result, things are much more reliable, and also you got a better user experience. So I hope that was exciting. Thank you.